He was just an old man cleaning out his garage on a winter morning when he found something buried beneath the concrete floor. It looked like a simple metal sphere, cold, silent, lifeless. But the moment he touched it, the world began to shift. Time unraveled, memory bent, and the life he thought he had buried long ago came rushing back, clip by clip, regret by regret. This is not just a story about a machine, it's about guilt, about love lost, and the courage it takes to forgive yourself. And maybe, just maybe, it's also about you. So take a breath, because what you're about to hear might just change the way you remember everything. The wind outside howled softly through the thin, brittle trees, and snowflakes drifted like whispers across the cracked windows of Frank's garage. Inside, the air hung heavy with dust and grease, with the faint scent of old oil and something faintly metallic lingering, like memory. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting a dull yellow cone of light over a cluttered workbench. Frank, 61 years old, moved with the careful hesitance of someone who had long since stopped rushing through life. His denim shirt was frayed at the cuffs, and his heavy boots left trails across the dust-caked floor. But his eyes, blue, deep, weary, still watched the world with a quiet curiosity. He hadn't planned to spend the afternoon in the garage. In fact, most days he barely came in here anymore. Not since Marilyn. That garage had once been her favorite place to find him, coffee in hand, teasing him about the smell of carburetor cleaner clinging to his clothes. Now it was more like a mausoleum, of projects unfinished, ideas abandoned, memories buried beneath rust and silence. Frank was just moving an old shelf when it happened. He took a step back, his boot catching on something round and unyielding beneath the old tarp. There was a strange vibration in his leg, an almost imperceptible pull, as if the thing beneath had clung to him. Confused, he pulled the tarp aside and crouched, brushing away layers of dust and old paper. There it was, a dull metallic sphere no larger than a grapefruit, resting half buried in the concrete. It wasn't like any tool or part Frank had ever seen. The metal didn't rust, and the surface pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of a sleeping animal. Frank reached out, fingers hesitant. The moment his skin made contact, the sphere shuddered slightly, and then there was a low, resonating hum. He jerked his hand back. What the hell? He looked around the garage as if expecting someone to step out and laugh, but there was only silence, broken by the distant ticking of a wall clock. He knelt again and this time pushed a little harder. The sphere didn't move, but the concrete around it cracked with a brittle groan. Then, in one sudden motion, the floor beneath him gave way. Frank yelped, stumbling back as the concrete split into perfect geometric slices, revealing a hidden chamber below. The hum grew louder. Cautiously, heart thudding like a war drum in his chest, Frank found the small ladder embedded into the side of the opening. It didn't make sense, but he wasn't thinking anymore. He was just moving, like someone walking in a dream they couldn't quite control. He descended. The space below was dim, lit by a soft blue glow. It looked like a control room, a capsule maybe, its walls lined with smooth panels and buttons labeled in no language he knew. In the center of the room was what looked like a console, with a single seat, dusty and worn, as if waiting for someone who never returned. Frank didn't believe in aliens or secret government tech or time machines. He believed in spark plugs, in rust, in the sound of a wrench clicking into place. And yet, he was here. He reached out to the console, fingers hovering above a single glowing button. He hesitated, but something, curiosity or loneliness or both, made him press it. The room pulsed with sudden light. The hum became a rhythmic throb like a heartbeat amplified. And then, movement, not of the walls or floor, but of reality itself. Suddenly, Frank was standing in a field. No, not standing. Floating? The air was thick, the sky a violet haze, and in front of him was a man, dressed in modern clothes, sinking into a pool of black mud. "Hey!" Frank called out. The man didn't respond. He struggled for a moment, then simply vanished beneath the surface. There was no scream, no splash. Frank blinked, staggered back, only there was no ground to step on. The scene dissolved like smoke, and then another appeared, a small boy and his snake. At first it was innocent, the boy letting the snake wrap around his arm. But then, without warning, the snake bit him. The boy screamed and the snake hissed, its eyes glowing an eerie gold. Frank recognized that face. That boy, it was him. That snake had belonged to him. Sammy, he whispered, stunned. Scene after scene followed. A dog pooping on a lawn, a Tesla smashing against a wall and remaining undamaged, a whirlpool in the ocean swallowing a cruise ship whole. None of it made sense, and yet each one seemed to reach inside Frank, poking at memories he hadn't touched in decades. There was no way to stop it. Each time he blinked, a new moment appeared, like an endless feed of viral clips pulled from the corners of the internet. But this wasn't a screen. This was real. He could feel the wind, hear the sounds, sense the tension, and more than that. The clips began to change. They weren't random anymore. They were about him. Memories. Reconstructed as absurd little vignettes, cloaked in humor, chaos, randomness, but unmistakably his. The time he and Marilyn danced in the rain, the night he broke his leg running from a raccoon, the day he lost his job. He felt it building, like a wave rising on the horizon. "What is this?" he whispered, eyes darting around. There was no one to answer, only more clips, more noise, more memories twisted into surreal parodies. A man juggling bottles on fire, his face half lit by neon. A car crash slowed into poetic motion. A kitchen fire that looked like an art exhibit. And then...
silence. One final scene.
A woman standing in the rain, blonde hair matted, eyes dark with anger and grief. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Frank's heart nearly stopped. Marilyn, the last time he saw her, she had walked out that garage door in a storm, keys in hand, too angry to wait, too proud to turn back. He had watched her go, stubborn, too angry himself to call her name. He stepped toward the image. Her mouth moved again. Still no sound. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The image didn't react. The rain kept falling. Then the console appeared again, the blue glow pulsing. Frank was back in the chamber, knees weak, heart pounding. He collapsed into the chair. "What is this place?" he asked aloud. The console responded this time, with a slow, deliberate voice that filled the chamber from nowhere and everywhere. Memory, regret, escape, choice. Frank closed his eyes. Whatever this was, it wasn't a machine, it wasn't just technology, it was something else. Something meant for him. And he had just begun to scratch the surface. At first, Frank thought he was watching someone else's dream. He stood in a field of orange grass, beneath a sky split with shifting colors, green bleeding into gold, purple merging with silver. The wind carried scents he couldn't name. It wasn't frightening, not yet. It felt more like standing in a child's fantasy. Except he wasn't just watching, he was inside it. A figure emerged from the grass, a man in a full tuxedo, waddling forward while pushing a wheelbarrow filled with baseballs. Behind him, a team of grown men crawled on hands and knees, forming a human chain. They grunted like oxen, dragging the man forward. Frank blinked. "What the?" Before he could finish, the scene evaporated. A new one snapped into place. He was suddenly in a city alley, standing next to a teenager who was cleaning drums with a neon green toy gun. The beat of techno music vibrated through the concrete. Above them, a bubble machine spilled rainbow spheres into the air. A cat, wearing sunglasses, sat on a hovering scooter nearby. Frank turned to the teen, mouth open, but again the world shifted. He stood now on a beach. Not just any beach. This one had a vending machine for underwater Coca-Cola. A man in a scuba suit inserted a coin, retrieved a can, and cracked it open under the waves. Bubbles spiraled upward like dancing jellyfish. Frank laughed. Actually laughed, because it was so absurd. "This has to be a dream." The machine answered him. He didn't hear it, but felt the response in the air, not a dream. A layer. Frank's smile faded. That word, layer, scraped at something inside him, a strange sensation in his spine, like a memory he hadn't earned yet. He walked forward and suddenly found himself not on the beach, but in a living room. A man sat on a recliner, eating ice cream with a hammer. A grumpy-looking dessert stared back at him from a plate. Frank stepped backward. The recliner vanished. Now he was looking at a Cybertruck smashing into a wall, except it didn't dent, not even a scratch. Instead, it bounced backward like a rubber ball, then drove off with a nonchalant beep. A voice from nowhere said, "Indestructible." "Okay," Frank muttered, "this is officially nuts." But the clips kept coming. Each transition was seamless, like flipping through an endless reel of bizarre internet videos. But he was inside each one. He could smell the burning rubber, feel the spray of salt water, hear the click of plastic bottle caps bouncing across linoleum. And still, No escape. He tried to close his eyes, but the world didn't disappear. He covered his ears, and yet the sound poured in like a flood. He started running, hoping to outrun the madness, but the scenes kept forming in front of him. He skidded to a stop as the ground gave way. Now he was standing on a rotating platform, giant Lego pieces orbiting around him. A DJ with a mohawk made of spaghetti flung his arms wildly, spinning records shaped like cheese wheels. In the crowd, a man with Tom and Jerry painted on his nails, a woman wearing earrings made of giraffe figurines, and what looked suspiciously like a clown with a lightsaber. Frank took a step back and fell straight into the next scene, a birthday party. The decorations were overwhelming. Balloons shaped like octopuses, streamers made of licorice, a cake the size of a bathtub. A little girl blew into a trumpet, summoning a life-sized Lego dog that barked and danced. Frank turned toward the table and saw himself. A miniature version of himself, child-sized, wide-eyed, holding a sparkler and laughing. He gasped, staggering backward. "What the hell is this?" "Interpretation," the machine whispered in that same strange non-voice. Now he was sitting on a bus, only the bus was being powered by people pedaling like a monorail. One passenger wore a medieval helmet, another was balancing a bowl of spaghetti on their head. A man at the front opened a Heineken with a hammer, toasted the crowd, and jumped off as the bus rolled down a hill made of marshmallows. Frank clenched his fists. This isn't real. It is real as memory, as fear, as choice. Something shifted. The humor began to fade. Frank appeared next in a suburban street. A small dog barked from a yard. The man holding the leash looked exhausted. Across the lawn, a neighbor stormed out of his house carrying a catapult made of PVC pipes. Frank watched, stunned, as the man loaded the dog's poop into the catapult and launched it back across the fence. No one reacted. The world simply shifted again. Now he stood before a whirlpool, a monstrous spiral of water spinning in the middle of a calm ocean. Frank felt his stomach twist. He could hear the roar, taste the salt. There was a ship nearby, people waving, screaming, as the whirlpool pulled them in. Frank turned to run, but instead he landed in a public restroom. A woman stood outside a stall holding a foghorn. The moment the door opened, she blasted it. Inside, a man screamed. Frank spun in a full circle, searching for the console, a button, anything familiar. Nothing, only more clips. Now a boy was getting stung by an enormous bee. A girl accidentally deep-fried a whole chicken in her washing machine. A group of teens practiced karate on shopping carts. It wasn't funny anymore. The randomness became oppressive. Endless, each scene a puzzle piece, disconnected but somehow linked. Frank clutched his head. "Stop it! I want out!" The world flickered. Just for a moment the chamber returned. The chair, the console, the quiet hum. He lunged for it, but before he could touch the panel, blackness and a new voice, not like the others. Softer, human. "You're not watching anymore, Frank. You're remembering." Frank stood still, breathing hard, his fists trembling by his sides. The echo of that last voice, so calm, so certain, reverberated inside his chest. "You're not watching anymore, Frank. You're remembering." The words followed him as the world around him shifted once more. But this time, it didn't begin with nonsense. There was no rubber chicken orchestra or soda geysers exploding in shopping malls. Instead, Frank stood at the edge of a cornfield. It was late afternoon. The sun burned amber, casting long shadows across the dry stalks. A rusted mailbox tilted sideways on a wooden post. He knew this place. He had grown up here. Down the dirt road was a house, pale green siding, broken wind chimes on the porch, the front door hanging open just enough for sound to spill out. Music, piano. Frank's breath caught. He moved forward slowly, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The closer he got, the more the music pulled at something deep inside him, something frayed but still intact. The porch steps creaked under his weight. He reached the doorway, hand hovering just above the handle. Inside, a boy sat at the piano, small, awkward, maybe 10 years old. His back was hunched, his fingers clumsy but determined. Frank swallowed hard. It was him. He remembered this. That day, that feeling of wanting so badly to impress his father, to prove that music was worth something, that he was worth something. But the room wasn't empty. In the corner, a man stood watching, tall, broad shoulders, grease-stained overalls, his father. He didn't speak, he just shook his head. The boy at the piano faltered, notes clanged out of tune. The little version of Frank turned around, eyes wide. hoping for some signal of pride or understanding. None came. Frank watched the disappointment flicker across the boy's face like a light going out. Then, just as suddenly, the room fractured. The piano, the boy, the house, gone. He was standing in front of a school auditorium. The stage was dimly lit, the curtains half drawn. Children in makeshift costumes filed out onto the platform. A narrator began speaking in an overly dramatic tone and now presenting the fall of Atlantis, featuring dinosaurs, astronauts, and one very confused boy. Frank felt his stomach twist. This memory, too, was his, a fifth-grade play. He'd forgotten about it for years. He turned, and there he was again, a boy in a cardboard helmet, wrapped in a shiny silver blanket, meant to be an astronaut. But he wasn't moving. The kids danced and shouted around him, but the young Frank stood frozen, staring at the crowd, panic in his eyes. He had forgotten his line. The laughter from the audience wasn't cruel. It was mild, almost sympathetic, but the boy felt humiliated, and Frank, watching now as an old man, felt the same heat crawl up his neck. The scene dissolved once more. He found himself in a hospital room now, sterile white walls, machines beeping softly. A woman lay in bed, pale but smiling. Her hand rested on her swollen belly. Frank's heart stopped. "Marilyn," he whispered. She turned her head, looked right at him, not through him, not past him, at him. Tears stung his eyes. She reached out, her lips parting to speak, but no sound came. Her image glitched, flickered, and repeated like a broken reel, over and over, that smile, that reach. He stepped forward, reaching out. "Please, don't disappear again." The machine's voice returned. Emotion, root layer, core sequence unlocked. Frank screamed, "Stop saying things I don't understand." But the images were relentless. Now he stood outside their first apartment, the one with the leaky roof and tiny kitchen. Inside, Marilyn was laughing, trying to bake banana bread. The oven was smoking, the fire alarm was wailing. Frank chuckled through tears. She burned that loaf 3 times. Then, snap, a new image. The night he missed their anniversary. He was under a car, elbows deep in engine grease. Marilyn stood in the doorway of the shop, holding a small cake in both hands. She didn't speak, she just turned and left. Frank had forgotten that night, or forced himself to, and again snap. Another memory, the argument. The storm, the final words. Marilyn slamming the car door, tires squealing in the rain. Her taillights vanishing into the mist. This was no longer a stream of random madness. It was a reckoning. Clip by clip, the machine was forcing Frank to relive his life. Not just the moments he cherished, but the ones he had buried deepest. "You think I don't already know I messed up?" he shouted. "You think I haven't punished myself every damn day?" The air thickened, the ground beneath him cracked. "This is not punishment," the voice said, softer now. "It is permission." Frank shook his head. Permission to what? To suffer, to forgive. The next clip flickered to life, and Frank found himself in his garage again. But it was daylight, warm. Marilyn stood at the workbench holding a wrench like a sword, pretending to duel an invisible foe. He remembered this. A Sunday afternoon. They had spent it fixing a lawnmower that never ran again, but they'd laughed for hours. Marilyn looked at him now, not the camera, not the scene, but him. The older Frank. "I missed you," she said. Then the image dissolved. Frank collapsed to his knees. The weight of everything, the clips, the memories, the years, crushed him like gravity turned cruel. He didn't know how long he knelt there, gasping for air in a world that wasn't quite real, but was more real than anything he'd felt in a long time. Finally, he opened his eyes. The console sat before him again. Its light was dimmer now, waiting. And Frank understood finally that this wasn't a prison, it was a mirror, and the longer he stayed, the more it would show him. But maybe, just maybe, it would also show him how to find his way back. Frank sat in the glowing chair, eyes wide open but seeing nothing. The room was silent except for the low, steady pulse of the console's light, like the quiet breath of something waiting. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his hands gripping the armrest as if he might fall out of the chair and straight through the floor. The voice returned, sequence stabilized, next fragment selected. Before Frank could brace himself, the world around him crumbled. This time there was no bizarre entry point, no slow transition. One blink, and he was back there. The rain was falling hard. Wind whipped across the cracked concrete of the driveway. Lightning split the sky in jagged veins. The garage door was open, revealing a cluttered workbench, a hanging coil of extension cords, and Frank, 30 years younger, standing in the doorway with a wrench in his hand and anger on his face. Marilyn stood 10 feet away, her coat soaked through, car keys clenched in her hand. Her expression was cold, guarded. Hurt, but also done. "I said I'm going," she snapped, voice shaking not with fear, but with finality. "You're being ridiculous," the younger Frank shot back. "You don't even know where you're going. Anywhere but here." She turned, storming toward the car. Frank watched, jaw clenched, knuckles white around the wrench. He didn't chase her, didn't call her back, just stood there, too proud, too angry, too afraid to bend first. Frank, his older self, watched from the shadows of this moment. Paralyzed, his breath hitched as he saw the younger version of himself let her go. He wanted to scream, to rush in, grab his own shoulders and shake some sense into him. "Say something, damn it," he muttered under his breath. "Go after her," but he didn't. The younger Frank turned away, back toward the workbench, back to his tools. And then, screeching tires. The engine roared, followed by the sharp squeal of wet rubber on pavement. A flash of red taillights vanished into the storm. The scene froze. Raindrops hung midair. The sky paused in a crooked flash of lightning. The garage lights flickered into silence. Frank stood in the stillness, heart pounding. He remembered what came next, the phone call, the hospital. The doctor's voice, calm, rehearsed, hollow. The words accident, loss of consciousness, we did everything we could. Frank closed his eyes. He didn't want to see it again, but the machine had no mercy. The image dissolved and reformed. Now he stood in a sterile hallway. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Nurses moved like ghosts through fog. At the far end of the hallway was a door. Room 209. He didn't want to walk toward it, but his feet moved anyway. He reached the door, pushed it open. Marilyn lay in the hospital bed, her skin pale, her hair matted against her forehead. Her chest didn't rise, her fingers didn't twitch. Machines surrounded her, silent now, unplugged. And at her bedside sat him, the younger Frank, motionless, broken. The older Frank stepped into the room. He wasn't sure if he was visible here, if this version of him was real or simply observing. But the pain was real enough. He walked closer, barely breathing. On the small table next to her hand was a note, scribbled hastily, crumpled. He didn't remember writing it, but as he read the shaky scrawl, he realized, Marilyn had, "I just needed you to choose me. Once. Just once." Frank felt something tear loose inside his chest. He stumbled back as if the words had punched him. He had never seen that note, never knew it existed. Maybe he'd missed it. Maybe it had fallen between things, buried in the mess. Or maybe, just maybe, this machine, this sequence, was showing him something deeper than memory, something truer than fact. He dropped to his knees beside the bed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracked. "I should have stopped you. I should have said I was wrong, that I needed you more than anything, that I was scared." The hospital room faded. Now he was in a church. Empty pews, a coffin at the front. The casket was closed, but instead of mourners in black, the seats were filled with caricatures, fragments from the video world. A Lego man with melted arms, a dog wearing sunglasses, a rubber chicken orchestra, the same characters from before, now silently attending Marilyn's funeral. Frank stood at the podium. He had no speech prepared. He didn't even know why he was there, what was real anymore. All he knew was that every strange, surreal clip, every joke, every bizarre moment had been leading here, to this, to the moment he finally admitted the truth. "I kept building things," he said aloud. "Machines, engines, tools, because they were simple, predictable, they didn't leave you. The cartoon audience didn't respond, but people, Marilyn, she was messy, complicated. And I was too much of a coward to deal with that." He stepped down from the podium, walked toward the casket. He laid a hand on it. "I miss you, every day. And I never told you that. I thought you knew. But maybe knowing isn't enough. Maybe love needs to be louder than silence." The casket vanished. The church collapsed into stars. Frank floated in a void. Only the console remained, glowing faintly, as if waiting for his choice. The stars around him flickered like dying embers. Frank hovered in the void, no longer afraid, but not at peace either. The silence was deafening, not the absence of sound, but the weight of everything that had been said, and everything he had never said. "Where do I go now?" he whispered. The console reappeared. It shimmered, more translucent than before, pulsing not with commands but with something else. Invitation. Frank approached. The screen lit up. Reconciliation sequence initiated. He frowned. What does that mean? The world tilted. Suddenly he was in a room that looked familiar but wrong, like a poorly drawn version of his childhood bedroom. The proportions were off. The lighting was too even. The furniture too symmetrical. It felt artificial. And sitting on the bed was himself. Not young, not old, middle-aged, worn, angry, alone. Frank took a step forward. The other version of him didn't look up. I know who you are, Frank said softly. The man on the bed didn't move. You're the version of me right after Marilyn died, when I stopped answering phone calls, when I stopped caring about anything except the garage. Still no reply. You hated everyone, but mostly yourself. The man on the bed finally looked up. His eyes were hollow. Not sad, or not furious, just empty. What do you want? The man asked. Frank sat in the chair across from him. I think I'm supposed to forgive you. The other Frank scoffed. For what? For everything. Silence stretched between them. Then the younger man leaned forward. I built walls to survive. You think that's weakness? No, Frank said gently. I think it's pain. A new figure entered the room, another Frank. This one younger, arrogant, sharp-eyed. He walked in with the swagger of someone who thought he had it all figured out. The man who had prioritized his garage over his marriage. The man who always had an excuse, always had a project. I didn't need anyone, the arrogant Frank said. I was doing fine. No, you weren't, the older Frank replied. You were drowning, and you didn't even know it. Another Frank entered, teenaged, awkward, raw. He didn't say anything. He just stood in the corner, fiddling with a broken watch. Frank looked at all of them. I've lived with all of you inside me. Every regret, every stubborn mistake, every time I chose silence over truth. The arrogant Frank laughed. You sound like a therapist. I sound like a man who finally wants to stop hiding. The air shimmered again. The room stretched, bent, folded in on itself. Now Frank stood alone in the center of an infinite mirror. His reflections surrounded him, dozens, hundreds of versions, every age, every expression, some smiling, some weeping, some screaming silently. Some were distorted by time, others by bitterness. Tell me what you see, the voice returned, quieter now. Frank turned slowly, looking at them all. I see a man who tried, a man who failed, a man who loved deeply and ran away from it. I see mistakes. I see effort. I see shame. And, Frank took a breath, I see someone who still deserves to live. The reflections faded. Darkness returned. Then slowly a new scene emerged. Frank stood in a kitchen, modern, small, cozy, the kind Marilyn would have loved. A kettle whistled softly. A plate of cookies sat untouched on the table. Through the window, sunlight spilled across a tiny backyard garden. He didn't recognize the place, but it felt right. Marilyn entered. Not the ghostly, frozen image from before. Not a memory caught in a glitch. She looked real. She smiled, warm and calm, as if nothing had ever gone wrong. Frank's breath caught. I don't know if you're really her, he whispered, or just something this machine made to comfort me. She didn't answer, just stepped forward, took his hand. That simple touch sent a tremor through him. I'm sorry, he said, for not choosing you, for not chasing after you that night, for building machines instead of bridges. Her hand squeezed his. It hurt, she replied, but I knew you loved me. Frank felt tears rising again. Do you forgive me? She leaned her forehead against his. I always did. The light in the kitchen grew brighter, golden, warm. It wasn't fading, it was building, lifting, expanding. Frank felt himself rising with it, not floating but lightening, as if something he had carried for too long had finally been set down. The kitchen dissolved into sunlight. The console returned one last time. Its screen displayed one word, return. Frank hesitated. The journey had changed him, broken him, healed him, and now it was time to go back. He pressed the button, and the world turned white. Frank awoke with a jolt, the console light fading rapidly, the ground under him trembling as if the entire structure of this strange reality was beginning to collapse. The silence that had followed the word return was deceptive. Beneath it, a low-frequency hum now began to grow, a rumble like an avalanche stirring miles away but moving fast. He stood, legs shaky, heart thudding like a war drum. His mouth was dry. The air felt charged with something electrical, like the inside of a thundercloud. All around him, the chamber was changing. Metal panels warping, lights blinking in erratic pulses, the seams of the walls glowing red-hot for moments, then flickering out. The console buzzed, sparks shooting from the edges of its surface. Frank reached out to stabilize himself and saw his reflection on a now glitching glass panel, except it wasn't just his reflection. It stared back at him, blinking out of sync, features subtly distorted. The eyes were too sharp, the jaw clenched too tightly. And it spoke. "You think you can walk away now?" Frank's mouth went dry. He didn't answer. The reflection stepped out, not through the glass, but as if stepping from behind his thoughts. A second Frank now stood across from him. This version wore the same clothes, bore the same face, but there was something darker, colder. His eyes were steel, his voice was sandpaper. "You think you've healed, tied a nice little bow around decades of guilt, but I know the truth. You're not real," Frank said, even as he took a step back. The other Frank laughed bitterly. "Oh, I'm real enough. I'm every thought you pushed down, every time you looked away instead of in. I'm the version of you that stayed behind when you tried to move on." The walls around them began to flicker between scenes again, but these weren't the surreal vignettes anymore. These were memories twisted into nightmares. The night Marilyn left, but this time Frank screamed at her, venom dripping from his words. The funeral. But now, instead of mourners, the seats were filled with Frank himself, dozens of versions watching the casket close in unison. The hospital room, but the machines were gone, and Frank was alone, talking to no one, his voice echoing in an empty, colorless world. "Stop it," Frank said, fists clenched. The other Frank stepped closer. "You don't get to walk away just because you cried a little and said sorry. You built this place, Frank, this twisted memory machine. You crawled into it layer by layer, and now you want to pretend you're some kind of hero for climbing back out." "I didn't build this," Frank muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Didn't you?" The other Frank smiled, slow and cruel. "Maybe not with your hands, but with your heart, with your silence. You fueled this with every unspoken word, every door you didn't open, every time you told yourself it was too late." The world began to shatter around them. Cracks split the floor like lightning, scenes bleeding into each other. Frank on his wedding day, Frank alone at his workbench, Frank yelling into a storm, Frank sleeping on the couch while Marilyn stared out the window. "You were given a gift," the reflection growled. "A chance to remember, a chance to hurt. But that doesn't mean you've earned forgiveness." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Frank snapped, suddenly furious. "I'm trying to be better. Too late, it's never too late." The second Frank lunged, not with fists, but with words. Blistering memories, searing shame, a storm of scenes that hit like punches. Frank staggered through them, his father turning his back, his co-workers calling him distant, Marilyn crying quietly in the other room while he tuned out the world with the hum of his tools. "This is who you are!" the voice shouted. "You can't change it. You're too old, too broken, too cowardly." Frank fell to his knees, breathing hard, sweat pouring down his face. But then, something inside him shifted, a different voice. One quieter, from within. Not the machine, not the ghost, his own. "I'm not perfect," he said, breathless, "but I'm still here." The world paused, just for a moment. "I can't undo the past, but I can live the rest of my life better than I lived before." The other Frank wavered. "You need me," he growled. "Without me, you fall apart." "No," Frank said, rising to his feet. "Without you, I begin." He reached toward the console, not to run, not to escape, but to reset, to take control. The machine pulsed under his hand. The second Frank screamed, not in rage but in fear, as the chamber lit up in brilliant white, blinding, pure. The shadows burned away, the scenes dissolved, the hum grew louder, higher, until it became something else, silence, peace. And Frank stood alone, whole, chosen. Frank stood in the bright silence, his breath steady now, the storm within him having passed like a wave that had threatened to drown him but instead washed him clean. Around him, the chamber no longer flickered or twisted in chaos. It had grown still, not the eerie stillness of denial but the calm that followed decision. He looked at the console. Its once ominous glow now seemed gentle, even warm, like an old lantern lighting a path forward. The symbols across its surface had changed. No longer warnings, no more looping commands, just one word, choose. He placed both hands on the edges of the console and leaned in. "I'm done hiding," he whispered. And the machine responded, not in voice this time but in movement. The chamber peeled away like paper, layers of simulated memory folding back, revealing the skeleton underneath. The wiring, the structure, the architecture of everything he had just lived. He saw the frames of the scenes, the programming of pain and nostalgia, the tangled web of regret that had fueled the entire experience. The system didn't ask him what he wanted, it simply waited. And Frank, after so long drifting in a tide of what-ifs, finally knew. He reached out and touched the core panel. It was surprisingly soft, almost organic. A single button pulsed beneath his palm. The moment he pressed it, the world convulsed, not violently, but completely. The walls fractured into light. Every clip, every memory, every surreal scene collapsed into data streams that burst into shimmering particles. The field, the hospital, the clown funeral, the boy with the snake, all gone. In their place, dark space, vast and still. Then gently one final scene began to form, not a memory, not a clip, a room, simple, real. The garage, his garage, the one back in Nebraska, but cleaner now. Daylight filtered through the window. Dust motes danced lazily in the beam of the morning sun. The old workbench stood in its usual spot, the tools arranged with quiet intention. The scent of grease and cedar filled the air, comforting, grounding, and Frank was standing in the doorway, not a projection, not a memory, himself, awake, present, real. He didn't collapse, didn't cry. He just stood there for a long moment, letting the reality of being back soak into his bones. It was over, but it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. He walked slowly into the room, his footsteps solid on the concrete floor. He touched the surface of the workbench. His fingers left clean trails through the dust. He moved to the cabinet, opened it, and found something he hadn't touched in years, a leather-bound notebook. Marilyn's. Inside were old sketches, ideas, little plans they'd made together. Build a garden box, paint the kitchen, fix the back porch swing. Things they never got to. He sat down, opened to a fresh page, picked up a pencil, and started to write. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a dramatic manifesto. It was a story. His story. He didn't hide the ugly parts. He didn't skip the nights filled with silence or the mornings filled with anger. He told it all. But at the center of it, there was light, love, and a man who had finally come home to himself. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. Frank didn't notice, he just wrote. At some point, he flipped on the old radio. Jazz poured out, soft and low, the kind Marilyn used to play when they cooked together. He smiled. There were no fireworks, no applause, just the quiet sound of healing. And then, something new, a knock, soft, hesitant. Frank looked up, surprised. He hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't expected anyone. He rose, moved to the door, and opened it. Outside stood a boy, maybe 12, messy hair, nervous eyes. He held out a small cardboard box. "Sorry," the boy said. "I think this is yours. It was in our yard." Frank looked down. The box was plain but familiar. He took it gently, opened it, and inside was the metallic sphere, the one that had started everything. It no longer pulsed, no longer hummed, just sat there, inert, a relic, a reminder. He looked back at the boy and smiled. "Thanks, kid," the boy shrugged. "No problem." As he turned to go, Frank called after him. "Hey, what's your name?" "You like stories, Eli?" The boy shrugged again. "Depends." Frank nodded. "Me too." The boy grinned and ran off. Frank stepped back inside, closed the door, and with the box in one hand and the story in the other, he finally, fully, returned to life. The days that followed were quiet but not empty. Frank woke with the sun most mornings, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. There was a peace in routine now, not a numbness. He made coffee, swept the garage floor, reorganized tools just because it felt good to put things in order again. Sometimes, he just sat on the front steps with a cup in his hands and watched the street. The same neighbors walked their dogs. The same mail truck passed by. But something in him had changed, and so everything looked different. The boy, Eli, came by a few times, at first with an excuse, "My soccer ball rolled under your car," but eventually just to sit and talk. Frank didn't push. He didn't fill silence with advice or try to be wise. He just listened. And Eli talked. About school, about his dad working too much, about his mom's new boyfriend who didn't say much. Frank never told Eli about the machine or the chamber or the impossible things he'd seen. Some stories are too large to explain with words. But he did tell him about choices, about how sometimes the most important ones are the ones no one sees, and that it's never too late to make a better one. One afternoon, Frank took out the box with the metallic sphere and placed it on the garage workbench. It hadn't moved since it returned to him. No lights, no hum, just a lifeless piece of metal. He thought about throwing it away, but instead, he unscrewed the lid and carefully placed the sphere inside an old metal toolbox. Then, he locked it and left it there, not hidden, just finished. Closure, after all, wasn't about forgetting. It was about letting go of the need to relive, about choosing to carry memory instead of being carried by it. That evening, Frank sat at his small kitchen table, lit only by the soft yellow glow of an old lamp. His notebook sat open beside a half-finished cup of tea. On the table was a small device, his old voice recorder, the one he used to use to jot down repair notes, reminders, shopping lists. He picked it up, pressed record, and began to speak. If you're hearing this, maybe you stumbled onto it by accident. Maybe you found it in a box at a garage sale or buried in a drawer somewhere. Or maybe, just maybe, you were meant to hear it. Either way, let me tell you something. I used to think the past was like rust, that once it set in, it would eat away at everything, no matter how much you scrubbed. I used to believe that mistakes stuck to you like oil stains. You could try to hide them, try to clean them off, but they always came back. I lived a long time like that, longer than I care to admit. I stopped calling people. I stopped answering questions. I lived in a shell that looked like a garage full of tools. But inside, I was empty. Angry, too. Not at anyone in particular, just angry at the way things turned out, at the things I couldn't change. He paused, took a breath, then continued. But I learned something, or maybe I remembered something. That it's not the memories that haunt us, it's the silence we wrap around them. I was given a chance, one I still don't understand fully. Maybe it was a miracle. Maybe it was a machine. Maybe it was just my own mind, trying one last time to save itself. Doesn't matter. What matters is what I saw, what I felt, and what I chose after. He picked up the cup of tea, took a small sip, and smiled. I chose to forgive myself. Not because I deserved it, but because holding on to pain doesn't bring anyone back. It only keeps you gone, too. I chose to remember my wife for her laugh, for her warmth, for the way she used to dance in the kitchen when she thought I wasn't looking. I chose to live the rest of my days in truth, not shame. And I chose to tell this story because maybe, just maybe, there's someone out there who needs to hear that it's okay to begin again. He clicked the recorder off, set it down. Outside, the sky had turned purple, stars just beginning to blink into view. A breeze rustled the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then quieted. Frank stood and walked to the window. He thought of Marilyn. Not the hospital bed, not the casket, but the woman twirling barefoot on the lawn in a sundress, holding a garden hose and laughing at the mess she made. That was the memory he wanted to keep, the only one that mattered now. He smiled, not sadly, but softly. Then he whispered, "Good night, love." The next morning, Frank uploaded the recording to an online forum called Voices Unheard, where people shared letters and confessions meant for no one and everyone. He didn't sign his full name, just F61 Nebraska. He didn't expect responses, but they came. Comments from strangers, people who said they understood, who'd lost someone too, who'd been angry too long, who needed to know it wasn't too late. Some just wrote, "Thank you." Others wrote, "You're not alone." And one, from someone named Lila in Oregon, simply said, "I'm going to call my father. I haven't spoken to him in 5 years. I think he'd like to hear from me." Frank read that one twice, then he closed the laptop, stepped outside, and looked up at the sky. It was blue, ordinary, beautiful. He wasn't looking for signs anymore. He didn't need machines or visions or voices. He had today, and that, he finally realized, was enough. There were moments that didn't quite fit into the main story. Moments that weren't dramatic enough to be remembered, but were real enough to leave fingerprints on the soul. Frank found himself reflecting on those in the quiet days after everything changed. He'd be making coffee and suddenly remember the way Marilyn used to hum when she read the newspaper. She never read headlines, just the funnies and the horoscopes. "I like stories with little truths," she'd say, "not the ones that scream doom and gloom." Frank never said it aloud, but he loved that about her, the way she carried hope like it was stitched into her bones. One afternoon, while reorganizing a drawer in the garage, Frank found a faded grocery list in her handwriting. Nothing important, just bread, eggs, cinnamon. But he stared at it for several minutes, the loop of the letters, the little heart she'd drawn above the I in cinnamon. It wasn't the words, it was the presence, the evidence of ordinary life. He kept it, slid it between the pages of his notebook, right next to the story he had written. Later that week, Eli came by again, this time with a broken bike chain. Frank didn't fix it right away. Instead, he handed the boy a wrench. "I'll guide you," he said, "but you're gonna fix it yourself." Eli looked doubtful but followed instructions. It took longer than it should have. There were groans and pinched fingers. But when the chain finally clicked into place and the pedals turned, Eli's face lit up. "I did it," he said, half laughing, half in disbelief. "You sure did," Frank nodded. "Now remember that feeling." As the boy pedaled away, Frank leaned against the doorframe and thought about legacy, not in the grand, statuesque sense, but in the way someone teaches you how to hold a tool, how to listen, how to forgive. That was legacy too. That night, Frank pulled out a dusty old photo album from the attic. He hadn't opened it in years. The pages stuck a little, but they were all there. A wedding photo, him in a suit too big for his frame, Marilyn glowing in off-white, holding wildflowers. Another from a camping trip in the Rockies. They'd gotten lost that weekend, argued for 2 hours, then laughed about it under the stars with burned marshmallows and cold coffee. He ran his finger along the edge of one photo, a blurry snapshot of Marilyn holding up a freshly baked pie with a triumphant grin. The crust was uneven. The kitchen behind her was a mess. It was perfect. He realized something then. The best moments of his life had always been messy, unscripted, real. The machine had shown him memories wrapped in surrealism, filtered through layers of guilt and fantasy, but the real memories, the ones untouched by fear or regret, those were quieter and more powerful. He understood now. He hadn't built the machine to relive the past. He had built it to avoid facing it, to distract himself with spectacle, because truth in its simplicity had terrified him. One evening, as he walked through a local park, he saw a couple on a bench, sharing a sandwich. Nothing romantic, just two people passing time. And he felt it again, that ache in his chest, not for what he had lost, but for how long he had waited to live again. He sat down on a different bench and watched the world go by. Joggers, teenagers with headphones, an old man walking a tiny, enthusiastic dog. Frank smiled. Life was happening everywhere. And this time, he was noticing. In the weeks that followed, Frank began volunteering at a local community center, not because he had to, just because he could. He helped kids fix skateboards, taught a few retired folks how to change oil, gave quiet advice where it was wanted, silence where it wasn't. People didn't ask about his past. He didn't offer. But sometimes, over coffee or in the middle of tightening a bolt, he'd share a small story, not about the machine, but about Marilyn, about the things they'd built together and lost and remembered. And people listened, not out of politeness, but because stories have a way of unlocking doors. One woman, Linda, a widow in her 60s, brought in her grandson's broken radio. They talked for an hour after the repair was done, about grief, about stubborn men, about how sometimes healing comes from unexpected places. Frank walked home that night feeling full, not fixed, not young again, but full. That was enough. One quiet Sunday, Frank sat down with a stack of letters he'd never mailed. Some written to Marilyn, others to friends he'd drifted away from. He didn't send them. He didn't need to. Writing them had been the release. But one letter he did mail, to his brother. They hadn't spoken in almost 10 years. Not out of anger, just time and distance. The response came 2 weeks later. Simple. "I've missed you. Come visit." Frank read the words 3 times, each time with a growing sense of something unfamiliar. Joy. He realized then that redemption wasn't a finish line. It was a path, a quiet one, walked in small steps, with hands outstretched, not fists clenched. In a final gesture, Frank returned to the place where he had first seen the machine, the garage floor. He stood there, alone, staring at the empty space where it had once been. He didn't need to rebuild it. He didn't need to destroy it. He simply acknowledged it, and then he placed something else there instead, a small wooden stool, hand-carved, with a notebook resting on top. Inside the notebook, a message. If you're reading this, then maybe you're looking for something too. I don't have all the answers, but I know this much: it's okay to hurt. It's okay to be lost. What matters is what you choose next, not yesterday, not tomorrow, but now. He left the stool and notebook there, not as a memorial, but as a starting point for whoever came next. That night, he sat once more at the kitchen table. Outside, the stars shimmered without urgency. Frank sipped tea and looked at the empty chair across from him. Then he spoke, soft and sure. "I'm okay now," he said, "and I think you'd be proud." The silence answered back, not with words, but with peace, the kind you only find after walking through fire and choosing to keep walking anyway. Sometimes healing doesn't come from fixing what's broken, but from learning to live gently with the cracks. Maybe you've lost someone. Maybe you've made mistakes you wish you could take back. Or maybe you just needed to hear that it's not too late to begin again. If this story moves something in you, I'd love to know. Leave a comment below, share a moment you've never forgotten, or simply tell us what part of Frank's journey resonated most with you. And if stories like this speak to your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next one. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We remember what it means to feel.